being here and hanging in there. So let's have a look at the last main section of the Satipatthana Sutta, and that's the section on Dhammas. But interesting reading about the section on Dhammas, about reading one of the kind of most interesting modern writers on the Satipatthana Sutta is Analayo, who Windhorse publish. And reading Analayo's introduction to this, you can really see him trying to figure out the relationship between all the different elements in the Dhammas section of the Satipatthana Sutta. But just trying to get a sense of the shape of it and trying to get a sense of the pattern that underlies what might at first sight be a little bit of a kind of portmanteau section for a number of different teachings. So in the Majjhima Nikaya version of the Satipatthana Sutta, the Dhammas section looks at the 5 hindrances, it looks at the 5 skandhas, the 8 sense spheres, I think it's 7 awakening factors, and the 4 noble truths. So it's quite a little cluster of teachings. Now, I wanted to say that to me, there's a sort of basic pattern to a lot of Dharma teaching, even I think you can say the sort of mainstream Dharma teaching. So if you look at the 4 noble truths, you've got pain, the cause of pain, the cessation of pain, and the path to lead to the cessation of pain. So you've got this kind of description of dukkha, and then this description of liberation from dukkha. The first 2 verses of the Dhammapada, I think, are the first 2 verses for a reason. So the first 2 verses of the Dhammapada, this is familiar ground for all of you, but experiences are preceded by mind, led by mind, and produced by mind. If one speaks or acts with an impure mind, suffering follows, even as the cartwheel follows the hoof of the ox. Experiences are preceded by mind, led by mind, and produced by mind. If one speaks or acts with a pure mind, happiness follows like a shadow that never departs. And that pattern of one alternative being suffering and one alternative being liberation runs through, I would say, the kind of mainstream of practical Buddhist teaching. And it seems to me pretty that shape that the Satipatthana Sutta takes. So if you look at the feelings section, for example, you're looking at worldly and unworldly. If you look at the mind section, you're looking at the mind with craving present or absent, with aversion present or absent, with delusion present or absent. And the pattern's not so immediately obvious when you come to the Dhamma section, but actually I think that's the underlying shape of the section. Analayo, in his sort of commentary on this section, suggests there's a kind of sequence. If you look at the hindrances, the skandhas, the sense spheres, the awakening factors, and the noble truths. So the way he sort of constructs that, he says with the hindrances, obviously you're looking at what traps the mind in suffering. Then with the aggregates, with the skandhas, you're starting to look at the nature of the self. You're starting to look at the misperception of the self that gives rise to the hindrances. And the sense spheres, you're looking at the relationship between self and world, and subject and object, and starting to look at the interrelationship between the 2 of them. With the awakening factors, you're starting to look at this unfolding step-by-step process of liberation. And then he suggests at the end of 4 noble truths, having been through that sequence, we're back to the 4 noble truths, and we're really seeing in depth the cause of suffering and the cessation of suffering. So that's the way Analayo sort of suggests we understand this sequence. But there's maybe an even more kind of fundamental way of looking at the Dhammas section. I said earlier in this little seminar that there are three different recensions of the Satipatthana Sutta that have survived, one in Pali and two in Chinese translation from the Sanskrit. And the Pali version is probably not the oldest of the three. It's not absolutely clear what is, but probably one of the Chinese translations from the Mahasangika tradition may be the older of the versions. But the three versions have two elements in common. And the two elements that they have in common are the hindrances and the awakening factors. So to me, we're back to that pattern. You're back to a description of what traps the mind in suffering and a description of what liberates the mind. And one of the things that in his commentary on this section, Bhante says that our experience is complex. And no framework exhausts the complexity, but the depth, the inconceivable nature of experience. But what different frameworks do is they give us a way of understanding our experience, a framework that lets us understand certain tendencies in our experience and gives us a way of engaging with it that transforms it. And if we take these two components of the shared core of the Satipatthana Sutta, of the hindrances and the awakening factors, you've got two frameworks. They're not the only frameworks, they're not exhaustive frameworks, but they're two frameworks that give us a way of looking at the mind when it's caught in confusion, and the mind when it's starting to liberate itself. And it gives us a way of engaging with our experience that moves us away from suffering and towards liberation. So in this last session, I want to look at these two frameworks, these two analyses of experience of the hindrances and the awakening factors. Yeah, a nice little quote from Bhante. Bhante, when he's dealing with the Dhammas section, it is kind of saying it's in some ways more complex than sometimes you might need as a practitioner. And he says, if you were to concentrate on the mindfulness of breathing, mindfulness of the four Satipatthanas themselves and the 7 awakening factors, you have a condensed form of the practice which would be very effective. So we can maybe take some essential elements from the Satipatthana Sutta that give us a framework that lets us work in that process of liberation. So the first section is the hindrances. And the hindrances, just to read it, how monks does one in regard to Dhammas, abide contemplating Dhammas? And here in regard to Dhammas, contemplating Dhammas in terms of the 5 hindrances, how do we do that? So the first thing is, if sensual desire is present, one knows there is sensual desire in me. If sensual desire is not present, one knows there is no sensual desire in me. One knows how unarisen sensual desire can arise, how arisen sensual desire can be removed, and how a future arising of the removed sensual desire can be prevented. So you've got that little, is it present, is it not present? How do we sustain the skillful? How do we move away from the unskillful? And that pattern gets repeated for aversion, sloth and torpor, restlessness and worry, and doubt. Same formula. You know that it's present, or if it's not present, you are aware of how unarisen can arise, how arisen can be removed, and how a future arising of the removed can be prevented. So that's the kind of framework. I don't want to spend a lot of time on the hindrances, but I did want to say a couple of things. I don't know if this is true or not, right? But the sense I get sometimes is that some people find the whole idea of hindrances a problematic one. And, you know, how does that square with kind of evaluating awareness? So I don't know if that's an issue that's arisen for anybody. It did in my own kind of meanderings around this thing. But one of if I can just first of all appeal to authority. This is such a recurring teaching in especially in the Pali canon, but you find it in other traditions as well. The Buddha keeps on coming back to this pattern that traps the mind. So the Buddha, it seems, thought this was an important and helpful teaching. And I'm always inclined to give the Buddha the benefit of the doubt. So there's, if I may just appeal to authority and tradition for a minute. But one of the ways that I've been thinking about it is that all the way through even this little seminar that we've been doing, we've been looking at the quality of awareness. We've been looking at this sort of basic experience of mindfulness. And then some of the refinements of mindfulness, like how we connect to a bit more clarity, that sense of connection, of metta towards our experience, sense of arising piti, a sense of arising sukha, and so on. So what we're looking at a particular quality of relationship to our experience and a particular quality of awareness. And one of the things that kind of made sense to me is the hindrances aren't so much objects of awareness that we're kind of pathologizing. They're qualities of relationship to our experience. And what you've got in the hindrance of craving is the opposite of openness. So if you're trying to bring an experience, a quality of openness to your experience, you're just noticing when we tighten up and we focus on a particular object, which craving makes us do. So it's almost like you're just looking at the quality of the awareness, quality of your relationship to your experience, and where you find it tightening and contracting. There's a natural letting go back into that openness. Where you've got you've got, you know, in the practice, we'll be looking for this sense of connection, this sense of aliveness to emerging experience. And what you've got in aversion is a resistance to experience. You're trying to push away. So in looking at hindrances, you're just starting to notice the quality of awareness that pushes away, getting a sense of what's it like when we do that. And again, a kind of almost a spontaneous choice to move into connection rather than resistance. With sloth and torpor, rather than the kind of energy that you get in piti and sukha, it's the mind kind of almost trying to retreat back into not having to pay attention, not being awake. So when that's present, you're deliberately allowing the energy, the vitality to become more present in the stream of our experience. And so on for the rest of the hindrances. You're just looking at whether or not the quality of awareness has that openness, the connection, the energy that moves it in the direction of liberation. And the kind of the instructions around it that we're looking at according to the sutta, how unarisen hindrance, or first thing that you do is you're just noticing what's present and what's not. So is sensual desire present or is it absent? So the first thing you're doing is just noticing the quality of the mental state. And quite often that's all you need to do. I was using this example yesterday of you catch yourself rushing and you naturally, you spontaneously just take a breath and slow down a little bit. So sometimes the awareness itself is enough to make the difference to the hindrance not being present. And I think there's sort of something practically important in that. I think we don't often have to make a meal of it. It's enough just to get the flavour of it and for something to spontaneously sort of balance itself and redress itself. Sometimes, though, that's not enough. So you get this second instruction of how one knows how an unarisen hindrance can arise. So you're starting to look at the conditions that create the sense desire or the aversion or the restlessness. And one of the points that there's quite a few points I think you can draw out of that, quite a few practice points. One of the places that this sutta goes is this little refrain at the end of each teaching that we're aware of the arising factors and we're aware of the cessation factors. We're aware of things rising, we're aware of their duration, we're aware of their falling. And one of the kind of elements in this teaching where it goes from being a concentration practice to being what's traditionally seen as an insight practice is you're starting to look at the conditioned nature, the impermanence of all of our experience. So the first thing I think that this teaching is getting at, of being aware of the arising factors and the cessation factors, is that we're just alive to that fluid, impermanent, transient nature of all of the experience that we habitually tend to reify and to fix. So there's that element of being aware of the, I can just find the text, that how an unarising hindrance arises. You're just noticing in real time that process of arising and cessation. But there's a sort of second part to it, I think, and that's to do with the conditions outside sitting practice that give rise to habitual mental states. Nice little aphorism from Bhante says, basically meditation's first aid. It's you doing a kind of first responder job on habitual mental states. But a lot of the time, actually, all you're dealing with is the mental states created by habitual behaviours outside the sitting practice. So you're starting to go back to the conditions that give rise to the hindrance in the first place. And the lovely example that Vajradevi gave yesterday of how aversion arises, how you would work with that aversion. And the next bit of the sutta, in a way, it's the flip side of that, talking about the hindrance can be removed. And on the previous condition, Bhante saying what happens in meditation is essentially a continuation of what happens outside meditation. And we have to start to work with the habitual patterns outside meditation. And one of my kind of go-to teachings is from the 8-point mind training. That there's from the 7-point mind training, there's this little teaching that train with slogans. And that the idea is that you want a summing up of the Dharma that you've got to hand when you need it. So this idea of some of the crucial teachings, you're getting boiled down enough to a slogan, so you've got access to it. And one of my favourite 8-point mind training slogans is, whenever disturbing emotions arise, may I firmly face them. And it's this idea that that the disturbance itself becomes the reminder to start to pay attention to your experience. So instead of kind of moving back into the habit of sense desire, into the habit of aversion, into the habit of doubt or restlessness, whatever it is, you're working out of this more sustained sense of connection to yourself. And what we were saying before is you can't always keep track of the complexities of our mental state, but you can keep track of that quality of connection to ourselves, and the kind of the sense of wholeness that comes out of that quality of connection. So whenever that sense of connection gets disturbed, that's the cue to come back to how we're habitually responding to our experience. And instead of going with the habit of moving into aversion or craving, we're using that disturbance as a cue to come back to the breath, back to the body, back to how we feel, and then this moment of choice about how we respond to how we feel. Anyway, the reason I'm making such a meal of this is this idea. I love this idea that meditation practice is first aid. It's you dealing with an immediate situation. But if you're trying to deal with the basic habitual shape that your experience takes, it has to be awareness starting to inform these moment by moment responses to how we experience things, how we respond to what we experience. And the obvious teaching around this is sila practice, that in the first precept, where you're committing to acting out of non-harm and acting out of kindness, you're working against the habit of aversion. Where you're committing to acting out of not taking the not given and out of generosity, you're working with the habit of or the hindrance of craving and the kind of clinging that we do. So the precepts are a way of giving a channel to that intention to take awareness into our experience in a more sustained way. And one last bit of teaching, quote Bhante again. Bhante's talking about appamada. And Adhisthana here recently, we just had some ordinations. And one of the bits of the ordination ceremony is after the actual ordination, there's a little exhortation in Pali, which goes appamadena sampadeta. And that's the little verse that usually gets translated as the, with mindfulness, keep making an effort. And as you know, probably, these were the last words of the Buddha. And it's in a way, it's the Buddha lifetime's teaching. So appamadena sampadeta. And appamadena as mindfulness has got a particular connotation to it. What Bhante says about it is that the most radical solution to this is the cultivation of appamada. And appamada is an overall awareness that takes into account a broad range of conditions, enabling us to be active and open to what's going on around us while still maintaining mindfulness. And the crux of appamada is you're alive to the flavor of what's arising. Is it closing you down or is it opening you up? So the last teaching of the Buddha, I'm sure there are subtler readings of this, but one way of understanding it is that the crux of the practice is this ongoing sensitivity to whether the mind is tending to move into those habits that close it down, or whether it's able to respond in a way that's opening it up, that's able to sustain the mindfulness, able to sustain the connection, able to sustain the openness. And it's almost like if you take the Buddha's last words seriously, that sensitivity to the sustained quality of an experience is the kind of crux of what makes practice possible, starting to take the awareness off the cushion into our sustained experience. More to say about it, but maybe that's enough on the hindrances. We're just looking on the cushion and off it of when the habits are starting to close the awareness down, and we're just letting go, relaxing back in to that openness and that sense of connection to ourselves, connection to the world around us. So I want to finish off with the awakening factors. Just keep a track of the time. So the awakening factors might not be such a familiar list, but the awakening factors, you've got the same formula. How, in regard to dhammas, does one abide contemplating dhammas in terms of the 7 awakening factors? First, there's mindfulness awakening factor. And one knows there is the mindfulness awakening factor in me. And if it's not present, one knows there is no mindfulness awakening factor in me. One knows how the unarisen mindfulness awakening factor can arise. And one knows how the arisen mindfulness awakening factor can be perfected by development. So basically, it's the same formula. Is it present? Is it not present? If it is present, how do we encourage it to arise? If it's already present, how do we develop it and perfect it? So that's the kind of framework. And it starts off with mindfulness. Then it goes to Dharma Vichaya, which is investigation of dhammas, energy, joy, tranquility, concentration, and then this slightly mysterious last sequence. The sequence finishes with equanimity. So the sort of the culmination of this sequence of awakening factors is equanimity. And the text says, if equanimity awakening factor is present, one knows there is the equanimity awakening factor in me. If it's not present, one knows there is no equanimity awakening factor in me. One knows how the unarisen equanimity can arise and how the arisen equanimity awakening factor can be perfected. So if you come across this, it can seem perhaps a little abstract and perhaps a little formulaic. I think I've read that a lot of times and haven't made that much sense of it. But what you've got actually is it's a very, very close relation to other formulations. It's a close relation to the positive nidanas, for example. And what I've realized in doing this kind of practice is the positive nidanas are trying to describe an unfolding pattern of experience that as you start to take awareness into your experience, you set up the conditions that allow this pattern to gradually reveal itself, disclose itself, unfold itself in experience. And if you come at it as a kind of map of where we can take awareness to, and a kind of hint about the next arising elements that you might want to take awareness to support their emergence, to support their arising, you've got a really practical tool for what supports this process of awakening. So the factors of awakening aren't just a kind of checklist of the qualities that are there. They're a description of, if I may say so, an unfolding process. And what I'd like to do is just a little bit more in a minute or two reflective practice that try and get a sense of that unfolding process. And I think this idea of the awakening factors as a natural unfolding process, for me, it's quite a significant one. I remember in Subhuti's paper on, what was it called? I've got to an age where nouns are the first thing to go, right? But it's paper on the system of practice, basically. And one of the lines in that is that awakening is possible because there are currents in reality that lead in the direction of liberation. And our job as practitioners is to cooperate with those currents that lead in the direction of liberation. And what you've got in the awakening factors is a description of one of the currents that lead in the direction of liberation. And it's possible for us to tune into or set up the conditions for the arising of that current and making it a stronger shaping influence in our experience. And in the later tradition, I think that this is what the whole idea of Buddha nature was getting at. It's saying that there's something absolutely intrinsic to the nature of the mind, that if you set up the conditions, will reliably unfold. And again, it's an oversimplification, it's a systematization, it's a bit reductive, but it's giving you the major components of what that unfolding process looks like, and basically telling you where you can take your awareness. So that's what we've got with the awakening factors. Just something very sort of briefly about them. So the mindfulness is the first of them. And basically what it's saying is the whole sequence follows from that. So the first thing that you're doing is that you're starting to be attentive to experience. Second thing is this investigation, the Dhammavichaya. And Dhammavichaya, sorry to repeat myself, but we're just back to this noticing of, is what's present liberating us or trapping us? And it's an intention to move towards what liberates. And it starts really simply. If you look at the breath section, it says, was that a long breath or a short breath? Right, it's as simple as that. The whole process of Dhammavichaya just says, pay enough attention to your breath to notice if it was long or short. And then that skill is transferable. So then you're noticing pleasant or unpleasant. And then you're noticing pleasant in a way that closes me down or pleasant in a way that opens me up. So you're starting to get a qualitative sense of your experience. And then in the mind, aversive or free from aversion, craving or free from craving. So that quality of noticing the quality of experience and the natural tendency, the natural movement towards what liberates is what's going on in Dhammavichaya. Energy is just that move towards, energy translates virya. And one of the traditional translations of virya is, of course, energy moving towards the good, the skillful. So it's that natural move towards what liberates once you start to see it. Out of that comes joy. So, and joy is just the sense of energy being liberated, the awareness liberated, the mind being liberated, and what a deep relief that is. Energy that's been blocked, becoming free, awareness that's been trapped, becoming open. So joy is the emotional flavor of that. And again, I can get a little bit rhetorical about this. You read it, I get a bit excited. It's an unfolding process. It can start quite subtly. And all you're being asked to do is you notice the body release and relax a little bit. What's it like if you take awareness into that and let the awareness start to support that natural unfolding process? It doesn't have to be fireworks. You're noticing what's there and you're supporting its emergence by taking awareness into it. Out of the joy comes, the Pali is passaddhi, and it means tranquility. And tranquility, I think, basically it's a synonym for sukha, and just this idea of the deep sense of well-being that comes from your increasing availability to the whole breadth and depth of your experience. Again, I was quoting an Aluyo yesterday, just the idea of the whole of our experience held in an embrace of awareness and love. So that's what we're moving towards. And again, that's maybe where it's headed. It can start off as simple as paying attention to what we tend to shy away from. So it's just this process of connecting and opening up. The passaddhi goes to concentration. And again, it's just this concentration in the sense not of, this is familiar ground, not of forcible fixation, but of all of those energies of the psyche coming together into a coherent, integrated whole experience. So it's concentration in that sense. And then out of that, this quite mysterious category of equanimity. And I want just to read about Bhante and this. I've started off setting up this, in a way, this dualism between craving and liberation from craving, the mind pure, acting out of purity, and the mind acting out of impurity. So you've got this opposition. So what Bhante says about this last stage is that upekkha, in this context, marks the arising of an entirely new quality, the direct experience into the ultimate nature of things. Equanimity in its perfected form means you no longer make any distinction between yourself and others, because that duality has been transcended. A fully perfected equanimity has gone beyond dualism, even the dualism of being and non-being, self and other, enlightenment and non-enlightenment. This is the samatha jnana, the wisdom of equality, whose archetypal embodiment is the Buddha Ratnasambhava. So it's starting to move into something quite profound. And I suppose what I want to say is one of the beauties of this sequence, I think, is how accessible it is. You find your own level within it. Like if our level is, how do I stay with the breath? Then that's the level that you're working at. But out of that, the body starts to relax and release. Out of that, joy starts to arise. The joy starts to stabilize in awareness. Out of that, concentration arises. And out of that concentration, you start to be able to look a little more clearly, a little more deeply at the nature of all our experience. So you've got this beautiful, accessible map of where attention can go. And what I'd suggest is let's take 10 minutes and just try and get a little feel for where our sort of natural connection with that process would be. Actually, sorry, one more thing. I got an email question today asking about whether the jhanas were sequential or not. In the Anapanasati structure and in this awakening factor structure, it's a very clear description of a sequence. I think there's something about the nature of that sequence that's quite significant. That basically your mind's not always that tidy. Sometimes you'll see the impermanence of a bit of physical pain, and that's the access into something deeper. Sometimes it's going to be how you feel, sometimes it's what it is that's obsessing your mind. Every moment of experience has that capacity for awakening. So we don't need to think about it in too linear a nature. It's not as tidy as that. This is just a structure that lets us look at, in a helpful way, a kind of natural capacity of the mind. So let's see if that's true. Just starting off totally simply, aware of ourselves sitting here. Again, this intention to withdraw from what usually sparks off our habitual reactions. An intention to look a bit more carefully, a bit more deeply at our experience. Having a sense of what it is about that that's significant for us, important for us. What is it that draws us, pulls us, excites us? The possibilities of that deepening awareness. Starting off with that very simple, accessible experience of the breath coming in and out of our body. Mindful of the breath in the breath, just alive to what the breath feels like as a sensation in our body. Using the breath to connect us to the whole body. Just noticing how far into the body we can track the breath. Aware of the quality of the breath. Breathing in long, breathing in short. Shallow, deep, just alive, the quality of the breath. The beginnings of the awakening factors of mindfulness, of Dhammavichaya, of investigation. Out of that investigation, the factor of energy arising, mind becoming curious, more open to looking at experience. Noticing any tension, any tightness. a sense of the body relaxing and releasing with the out breath. Maybe the mind a little more still, breath a little more relaxed. Just noticing the extent that the awakening factor of passaddhi, of tranquility, is just naturally present, naturally arising out of the awareness. We don't need to let the process get any more complex than it needs to be. It starts to feel like too much to do. Just relaxing back to the breath and the body. Just laying that foundation for a more stable awareness. If it feels appropriate, just noticing, what does it feel like? What's the feeling tone of our experience right now? In particular, we're noticing any emerging qualities of pleasure that opens us up, connects us. To the extent that it's there, by attending to it, bringing our awareness to it, we give it a bit more room to unfold. To whatever extent it's present, just noticing the awakening factor of joy. Joy of connection, joy of our mind a little more awake. Out of that connection to the breath, to the body, to how we feel, just opening up to whatever arises in experience. Being able to be present to what arises with the mind when it's still not becoming active itself. A mother feels towards her children. out of that availability, contentment in relationship to our experience. First stirrings again of tranquility, of sukha. Just making a judgment about where your awareness naturally wants to go. Go back to the breath, go back to the body. If it feels appropriate, just starting to notice the quality of the awareness itself. For a sense of clarity, sense of connection, sense of spaciousness in the awareness. Of that sense of openness, that sense of spaciousness, just allowing ourselves to become more interested in it, more absorbed in it to the extent we can, just turning towards it. Sense of the mind naturally, easily moving towards concentration, openness to the whole range of our experience. Awakening factor of concentration, out of that open, concentrated mind, just alive again to the arising, the duration, the impermanence of all of our experience, living, unfolding life of it. Breath rising and falling, feelings rising and falling. It's present in our mind, our awareness, rising and falling. Nothing that we need to hold on to, nothing that we need to resist. maybe just the first hint of what the awakening factor of equanimity might be like. And then bringing our awareness back into the room. Meant to read this earlier and forgot to. If you don't mind, let me finish with a little reading. This is from an Anguttara Nikaya text, I think called the Cetana Karaniya Sutta, just the activity of the mind. What it says, it's the Buddha speaking, of course. And he says, for someone who's free from remorse, monks, it's not necessary to be willful, wishing, may I feel joy. It's natural, monks, that someone who's free from remorse, joy is born. For someone who's joyful, monks, it's not necessary to be willful, wishing, may I feel rapture. It's natural, monks, that for someone who is joyful, rapture arises. For someone whose mind is rapturous, monks, it's not necessary to be willful, wishing, may my body calm down. It's natural, monks, that for someone whose mind is filled with sukha, their body calms down. For someone whose body has calmed down, monks, it's not necessary to be willful, wishing, may I experience bliss. It's natural, monks, that for someone whose body has calmed down, they experience bliss. For someone who's blissful, monks, it's not necessary to be willful, wishing, may my mind become concentrated. It's natural, monks, that for someone who's blissful, their mind becomes concentrated. For someone who's concentrated, monks, it's not necessary to be willful, wishing, may I know and see reality. It's natural, monks, that for someone who's concentrated, they know and see reality. And then there's this beautiful metaphor, I think, from the Upanisa Sutta of pools being overflowing, filling the next pools, overflowing, filling the next pools. So I guess what I wanted to finish on is just this idea that in the Satipatthana Sutta, you've got a description of this natural unfolding process that you don't need to will. You, by taking awareness into the Satipatthanas, you start to set the conditions up out of which arises this natural unfolding process, and the awareness just supports and nurtures the process being set in motion. So it started off saying that it's the direct path to the liberation for suffering. And I hope you've got a little bit of a sense of how that first step into attention to the breath and the body sets up a momentum, sets up a set of conditions that sustained for 7 years, or 7 months, or 7 weeks, or at least 4 hours online on Zoom, gives you a little bit of a sense of the momentum that is set up by that act of attention. So thank you so much for coming. I meant to have more discussion, so I'm sorry to have monopolized the airtime, but I hope some of that was useful.
Thank you, Dhammarati, Ratnachuda. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It was very useful, Dhammarati. Thank you from Madhusri.
Thanks very much.
Yes, thank you very much, Dhammarati. That's fantastic.
Yeah, thank you. Really useful. Thank you. You brought so much clarity to it for me. Thank you.
Mm.
You, Dhammarati.
Mhm.
Thank you very much, Amarati. Bye, everybody.